The stagecoach from Abilene arrived 40 minutes late on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1878, and the only passenger who stepped down into the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas, was a woman traveling alone with nothing but a worn carpet bag, and a silence around her so complete it seemed to precede her like a second shadow. Clayton Prescott noticed her from across the main street before she had even steadied herself on the running board. He had been leaning against the post outside the feed store, rolling the brim of his hat slowly between his fingers the way he always did when his mind was working on something it could not quite settle. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened face that spoke more of hard work than vanity, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that the Kansas sky turned just before a serious storm decided to announce itself. He had owned the Prescott Ranch 4 miles east of town for going on 6 years now, and in all that time, not one single thing had stopped him cold the way she did. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had once been fine and was now simply clean, and her brown hair was pinned up with the kind of careful precision that suggested she had taken pains with it that morning despite whatever circumstances had brought her here. She was perhaps 25 or 26, he guessed, with a quality in the set of her jaw that he recognized from people who had survived things they would rather not name aloud. She stood beside the stagecoach, looked up and down the main street of Caldwell with eyes that were amber and steady and entirely unafraid, and then she picked up her carpet bag herself before the driver could offer, and she walked directly toward the only hotel in town. Clayton did not follow her. He was not a man who chased things that had not invited the chase. But he did push himself off the post and watch her walk, and something in his chest that had been settled and quiet for a long time made a sound like a door shifting on its hinges in a wind. Caldwell in the autumn of 1878 was a cattle town of approximately 1,200 souls, sitting just above the Kansas Indian Territory border, doing the complicated business of being a shipping point for Texas cattle, while also trying to persuade itself it was becoming respectable. There was a main street with a hotel, 2 saloons, a church that the pastor was perpetually fundraising to finish, a dry goods store, a barber shop, a sheriff's office, a livery stable, and a restaurant run by a widow named Mrs. Alderman who made the best corn bread in the county and was fierce about it. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately and assessed within the hour, which made the woman's arrival in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in autumn particularly conspicuous, because there was no good reason on paper for a woman traveling alone with no letter of introduction to arrive here at this time of year. The cattle drives had wound down for the season. There was no family on record waiting for her. No telegram had preceded her. No one at the stage office had a name to put to the booking, because the agent in Abilene who sold her the ticket had simply written "Lady Passenger," and the amount paid, which was correct and complete according to the rules of the line. Her name was Etta Covington, and she had reasons for traveling the way she did that she was not prepared to explain to a town full of strangers, and she was reasonably certain she did not owe them an explanation. She checked into the Caldwell Hotel under her real name, because she was not a person who lied about what could be verified, only about what would not be understood. The hotel clerk, a young man named Tobias with a neck that seemed slightly too long for his collar, wrote it down and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who wanted very badly to ask a question and was not quite brave enough to do it. "Is there work available in town?" she asked him directly before he could gather his courage. Tobias blinked. "Work? What kind of work, ma'am?" "Something honest," she said, and the quality of her voice when she said it made Tobias decide not to ask the question he had been building up to. He told her that Mrs. Alderman at the restaurant sometimes needed help, and that the dry goods store occasionally employed someone to keep accounts, and that was about the extent of it for a woman of apparent refinement in Caldwell in October of 1878. Etta thanked him with a nod that was more decisive than grateful, and carried her carpet bag up the narrow stairs to the room he had given her. The room was small and clean enough, with a window that looked out onto the side alley rather than the main street, which suited her perfectly. She set her carpet bag on the bed and sat beside it and pressed her hands together in her lap and let herself breathe for exactly 2 minutes, which was the amount of time she allowed herself to be uncertain before she required herself to be practical again. She had enough money to last 3 weeks if she was careful, possibly 4 if she was very careful. She had arrived here not because Caldwell was a destination, but because it was far enough, and because when you were running from something complicated, far enough was the best you could reasonably hope for on a Tuesday in October. She unpacked what little she had brought. 2 additional dresses, both practical, a small wooden box containing her mother's silver earrings, and a letter she had not opened in 6 weeks, because she already knew what it said, and knowing what it said was enough without having to read it again. A hair brush, a small amount of medical supplies she had packed out of habit that spoke to a particular kind of history, and a book, George Eliot's Middlemarch, that she had read 4 times and considered keeping the same way other people kept a reliable friend. She pinned her hair back up where the journey had loosened it, changed into her second dress, which was dark green and marginally less creased than the blue, put the blue one out over the window hook to air, and went back downstairs to go speak with Mrs. Alderman about honest work. Clayton Prescott was coming out of the dry goods store with a list of things he had purchased, and a longer list of things they were out of when he saw her again. She was walking with purpose down the boardwalk on the opposite side of the street, and she moved the way people moved when they had made a decision and were following through on it. He had the irrational thought that she walked like someone who had been somewhere and was going somewhere, and the somewhere in between did not particularly intimidate her. He tipped his hat out of habit as she passed on the other side, even though she was not looking at him, and then felt slightly foolish for tipping his hat at someone who had not seen him do it. His foreman, a stocky Tejano man named Aurelio Vega, who had been with Clayton for 4 of those 6 years, and who had the quality of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing, had appeared at his elbow at some point during this small performance. "Who is she?" Aurelio asked. "I have no idea," Clayton said. "You tipped your hat at a woman who didn't see you." "I'm aware of that, Aurelio. You've been standing on this boardwalk watching her walk all the way to the other end of the street. Are you going to keep talking about this?" Aurelio smiled, which was an expression he deployed rarely and with great precision. "She went into Mrs. Alderman's," said Clayton, and picked up his supply crates and walked back to where his horse was tied. Mrs. Alderman was a round, practical woman of 52 who had buried a husband she had liked enormously, and 2 husbands before that whom she had liked considerably less. And she had opinions about everything, and expressed them without embarrassment. She looked at Etta across the counter of her restaurant with the frank, assessing look of someone who had seen quite a lot of things walk through her door and developed a reliable eye for sorting them. "You cook?" Mrs. Alderman asked. "Competently," Etta said. "I'm better at accounts and organization. I have experience with managing supplies and keeping records." "Where from?" Etta met the woman's eyes without blinking. "I've kept accounts in several establishments. I'm good with numbers and I'm thorough." Mrs. Alderman noted the answer that had not quite answered the question, but had answered it sufficiently for a practical purpose. "I don't have enough business to pay someone for accounts," she said, "but I need someone in the morning, 6 days, helping with preparation and serving. I pay $4 a week and you eat here, that's the offer." "I'll take it," Etta said immediately. "You start tomorrow morning, 5:30. "Thank you, Mrs. Alderman." The older woman studied her for another moment. "You got family coming?" "No," Etta said simply. Mrs. Alderman absorbed this. "You're running from something," she said, not unkindly, in the flat tone of a woman who had long since stopped dressing practical observations in polite clothing. Etta was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "I'm running towards something," she said. "I just haven't found it yet." That answer, in some way Etta could not fully articulate even to herself, was the honest one. She worked the first 3 mornings with her head down and her hands busy, and said little beyond what was required, which was precisely the right approach to working for Mrs. Alderman, who respected competence and quiet equally, and had a deep distrust of people who talked too much before they had demonstrated they could do the thing they were there to do. By the 3rd morning, Mrs. Alderman had moved her from simple preparation work to managing the supply ledger and the ordering list, and had also, without quite announcing it, given her a slight raise in the form of access to the storeroom for her own additional meals. On the 4th morning, Clayton Prescott came in for breakfast. He came in every Thursday, she would learn later, because his ranch was close enough to town to make a weekly supply run reasonable, and Thursday was the day he had done it for years. And he was a creature of settled, deliberate habit in the way that people were when they had built their habits consciously rather than accumulated them by accident. He sat at the table in the corner with his back to the wall and his hat on the peg beside the door, and he ordered coffee and eggs, and whatever Mrs. Alderman had made that morning that she was most proud of, which today was cornmeal porridge with dried apple, and he had the newspaper from Wichita that was 3 days old and read it as if the news had not aged. Etta brought his coffee. He looked up when she set it down, which was simply the natural motion of noticing who had brought a thing to you, and then he went still in the particular way that she had begun to notice was characteristic of him. This quality of going very quiet and very present at the same time, as if his attention once given was total. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Neither of them said anything else. She went back to the kitchen. He drank his coffee and read his newspaper and ate his breakfast, and when he left he said goodbye to Mrs. Alderman and tipped his hat to Etta in a way that was neither intrusive nor perfunctory, simply genuine, and went back out onto the street. Mrs. Alderman watched the door close behind him and then looked at Etta with an expression that was 3 parts amusement and 1 part something more serious. "That's Clayton Prescott," she said. "Yes," said Etta, who was already back at the supply ledger. "He owns the Prescott Ranch east of town. Good man, honest, works hard, doesn't complain, doesn't drink to excess, which puts him in the top 10% of men in this county." She paused. "He's been alone since his wife passed 4 years ago." "River fever," Etta looked up from the ledger. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and the quality in her voice when she said it was genuine in the way that only people who have also survived loss can make genuine. "He doesn't much say it out loud," Mrs. Alderman continued, returning to her pan, "but he's the loneliest man I know, and I know quite a few." Etta said nothing to that, but she held it somewhere quiet inside her and went back to her numbers. The following Thursday he came in again, and this time when she brought his coffee he said, "I don't believe we've been introduced properly. I'm Clayton Prescott." "Etta Covington," she said. He nodded once as if her name had confirmed something he had already suspected without knowing it. "You're new to Caldwell. I arrived last week. Settling in, working on it," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, a wry acknowledgement of the effort involved that made the corner of his mouth lift very slightly. "It's a decent town," he said, "better than some." "I've seen worse," she agreed. He seemed to consider asking her something and decide against it, which she appreciated more than she could have easily explained. He picked up his coffee cup and she went back to the kitchen, and neither of them made more of it than it was, which was 2 people exchanging names on a Thursday morning in a cattle town in Kansas, which was exactly what it was and nothing more yet. But she found herself thinking about his eyes. The storm before it happens, gray-green of them. The way he went still when he was paying attention to something. And he found himself on the ride back out to the ranch thinking about the quality of her voice when she said she had seen worse, and how it was neither bitter nor boastful, simply the statement of someone who knew what they were talking about. The complications began at the end of October when a man arrived in Caldwell looking for a woman. He came in on horseback rather than by stage, which was a different kind of arrival, and he went straight to the sheriff's office, which was the kind of thing that people noticed in a town where the entire population could be called a community without exaggerating. His name, as it came to be known within a day, was Gerald Holt. He was somewhere between 40 and 45, well-dressed in the manner of money rather than work, and he had the kind of face that was good-looking in the way that a well-maintained tool was good-looking, functional, and cold. He told Sheriff Tom Briggs that he was looking for a woman named Etta Covington, who was his ward, recently come into a significant inheritance from her late father, and who had unfortunately suffered some distress of the nerves and wandered from his care and protection, and he was dreadfully worried. Sheriff Briggs, who had been the law in Caldwell for going on 8 years, and who had developed through that tenure a remarkably reliable nose for when someone was telling a truth, and when someone was constructing a truth from selected pieces of a larger and more complicated reality, wrote this down in his ledger and nodded, and said he would see what he could do. Then he walked down to Mrs. Alderman's restaurant, not because Etta had told him anything, but because he had seen her arrive, and because Gerald Holt's recitation had had a particular smoothness to it that reminded him of a riverbank that had been graded before a flood. He did not tell Etta about Holt directly. He sat down at the counter and asked Mrs. Alderman for coffee, and mentioned in the casual way of someone discussing whether that a man had come to town looking for a woman, and described the man. Etta had been standing 6 feet away with a dishcloth in her hands when he said this, and Mrs. Alderman watched her go very still in a way that was different from the ordinary stillness of someone listening. The sheriff watched it too. Then he drank his coffee. Then he said, conversationally, "Course, if there was a woman who didn't want to be found for reasons that were her own business and not mine, I'd say the best thing for that woman would be to not be too visible for the next little while." He finished his coffee, left the correct coins on the counter, and went back to his office. Mrs. Alderman waited until the door had closed and then looked at Etta with those sharp, practical eyes that had sorted the true from the convenient across 40 years of looking. Etta set down the dishcloth. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. But her eyes, when she met Mrs. Alderman's, had something in them that was not quite fear and was not quite grief, and was something more complicated and more specific than either. The look of someone who has done the right thing and is paying for it anyway, which is its own particular kind of exhaustion. "His ward," she said, almost to herself, and the word came out with a very slight edge, not enough to be called bitter but enough to give it a shape. "Is he your guardian?" Mrs. Alderman asked plainly. Etta was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He was appointed trustee of my father's estate when my father died 3 months ago. My father left everything to me, every cent of it." She paused. "Gerald Holt has been managing that estate for 2 years and does not, in my estimation, want it examined too closely." Mrs. Alderman absorbed this with the stillness of someone adding a significant piece to a picture that was now becoming clear. "You have proof of this?" "I have records," Etta said. "I kept my own. He didn't know I was doing it." "Where are they?" Etta touched the carpet bag that she had taken to keeping behind the kitchen counter during her working hours, which Mrs. Alderman had always assumed was merely the habit of a woman who did not want her personal things in an unlocked hotel room. "Here," she said simply. Mrs. Alderman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to send a message to someone." She wrote a note, folded it, and gave it to the boy who did odd jobs for her, a 10-year-old named Sam, and told him to ride it out to the Prescott Ranch without going past the sheriff's office or the hotel. Clayton read the note standing beside his barn in the afternoon light, his horse not yet unsaddled from the morning, and the note said only, "Come to the back door after supper. There's something you need to know. Bring your good judgment. M. Alderman." He came at 7, after supper, through the alley to the back door, because when Margaret Alderman sent for a man using her initial and requested good judgment, it was the kind of note you did not discuss with anyone before answering it. Etta was still there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face when she saw him was something complicated, not quite relief, not quite embarrassment, something in between that contained both. "Mr. Prescott," she said. "Miss Covington," he said, and took off his hat and sat down at the table across from her because Mrs. Alderman pointed at the chair in a way that did not invite debate. Mrs. Alderman told him what Etta had told her, plainly and completely, with Etta sitting there neither interrupting nor correcting, only watching him receive it. He listened to the whole of it without speaking. Then he said to Etta, "These records you kept, how complete are they?" "Complete enough that a court of law would find them interesting," she said. "How did you keep them without him knowing?" "I kept duplicate ledgers. He trusted me with the household accounts because I am, as he repeatedly described me, good with numbers. He did not consider that I might also be interested in the larger accounts." She paused. "My father trusted Gerald Holt because my father was a good man who had a poor instinct for dishonest ones. I trusted him longer than I should have because I was trying to honor my father's judgment." The edge in her voice when she said this was the specific kind that came from being angry at something you could not undo rather than at something you could. "When I understood what he was doing and what he intended to do, which was to present me with a marriage proposal that would have given him permanent legal control of the estate, I took the records and I left." Clayton looked at her for a long moment with those storm-colored eyes. Then he said, "Without a letter of introduction." "Without anything," she confirmed. "There wasn't time for anything. And a story you can't tell. A story I couldn't tell to most people in most places, because in most places a woman with accusations against her appointed trustee has considerably less standing than the trustee himself," she said, with the precision of someone who had thought this through completely and arrived at the accurate conclusion. He nodded. It was the nod of someone acknowledging a truth they recognized rather than receiving information that surprised them. "Kansas has a district court in Wichita," he said. "Judge Henry Watts, he's a fair man. I know this from personal experience with a land dispute 3 years ago." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "There's also a lawyer in town, Eli Cross. He handles mainly wills and land titles, but he's competent and he doesn't like dishonest men any more than I do." Etta looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked back at her. The expression on his face was not complicated, which was perhaps the most unusual thing about it, because every other face she had looked at in the past 3 months had contained complications. His was simply, clearly, something direct. "Because you came here alone with a story you couldn't tell, and I don't need either the letter or the story to see that you're telling the truth, and because Gerald Holt is the kind of man I have a particular dislike for." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the silence of something settling into a shape that fit. "You don't know me," she said, not arguing it, simply noting it. "I know enough," he said, "and I'll know more in time if that works for you." The very slight smile that crossed her face then was the first smile he had seen from her, and it was unexpectedly warm, with a quality of surprise in it, as if she had not expected to smile and had done it involuntarily. "You're very direct," she said. "It saves time," he said, "which is generally a resource worth saving." Mrs. Alderman, who had been making a production of cleaning an already clean counter at the far end of the kitchen, permitted herself a quiet, satisfied expression that neither of them saw. Eli Cross, the town's lawyer, was a thin, precise man of 48 with a meticulous manner and a genuine, if carefully suppressed, passion for his work. He sat across his desk from Etta the following morning with Clayton beside her, not because she needed him there, but because he had offered and she had, after a brief consideration of her circumstances, accepted, and together they listened to Eli Cross review the contents of the records she spread carefully across his desk. He was quiet for a long time. He turned pages. He read entries. He compared columns. Then he took off his glasses and set them on the desk, and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man, calculating something significant. "This is," he said, choosing his words with care, a very thorough accounting of what appears to be a systematic diversion of estate funds over a period of at least 18 months. 22 months, Etta said. I traced it back to the beginning. Cross picked up his glasses again and looked at her over the frames with an expression of professional appreciation. Miss Covington, did you have legal training? My father was a businessman, she said. He taught me to read accounts the way other fathers teach daughters to read music. He said numbers tell the truth when people won't. She paused, and something moved briefly across her face that was purely grief, clean and genuine, before it settled back under the composed surface. He was right. The estate's total value, Cross asked. Approximately $42,000 at the time of my father's death, she said. Based on these records, approximately $11,000 has been diverted through false invoicing and payments to entities that do not appear to actually exist. Cross let out a long, slow breath. We can file a petition with the district court in Wichita. The records you have here are more than sufficient to support an investigation. He looked at her steadily. However, Gerald Holt is currently in this town. Does he know where you are? Not yet, I believe, she said. Sheriff Briggs appears to be taking a measured approach. Tom Briggs is a good man, Clayton said. He'll give us time if he can. How much time? Etta asked. Enough, Cross said, already pulling paper toward him. I'll have the filing prepared by tomorrow morning. We'll need to get it to Wichita by the circuit rider or by personal delivery. He looked at Clayton. I'll write it myself, Clayton said, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than making an offer. Etta turned to look at him. He was looking at Cross, already working out the logistics in the practical, forward-moving way he seemed to approach everything, and she looked at the side of his face with its weathered, honest angles, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was safe. Not because he was large or because he was capable, though he was both, but because there was no performance in him. He was simply and completely what he appeared to be, and in the past 3 months she had been surrounded by the opposite, which made the genuine article feel remarkable. Mr. Prescott, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said. It was not a small thank you. It was the kind that carried weight. He held her gaze for a moment. You would have found your way through this without me, he said, meaning it. I'm just making it a shorter road. She filed the petition with Cross that evening. Clayton rode it to Wichita himself the next morning, and he rode hard, covering the distance in less time than the stage would have managed it, and he delivered the papers personally to the clerk of the district court, with a letter from Cross, and a brief spoken summary to the clerk that was clear enough that the clerk marked it for Judge Watts's immediate attention. Gerald Holt, meanwhile, had been in Caldwell for 2 days, and was growing impatient with the sheriff's measured manner. On the second afternoon, he presented himself at the sheriff's office with what he described as documentation of his guardianship and demanded to know the location of his ward. Sheriff Briggs received this documentation with the unhurried courtesy of a man in no particular rush. He read it carefully. He thanked Mr. Holt for his patience. He noted that while the documentation was no doubt in order, a thing being documented was not automatically a thing without question, and he said that, in the interest of all parties, he would need to verify certain matters before he could be of further assistance, and that Mr. Holt was of course welcome to continue taking his meals at the hotel. Holt did not like this, but he was too careful a man to make a scene in a sheriff's office, so he left with the satisfaction only partially suppressed on his face and went back to the hotel. Etta had not shown herself on the main street since the evening she learned he was there. She went between the hotel and Mrs. Alderman's through the alley, arriving and leaving at hours that made her easy to miss, and she worked her mornings at the restaurant and spent her afternoons at the kitchen table with Eli Cross's notes and her own records, which she had reorganized meticulously to make the documentation as clear and irrefutable as possible. On the third day of this careful arrangement, Clayton came back from Wichita. He came in through the back door of the restaurant at dusk, and Etta was there, and she looked up from her papers with an expression that went from composed and guarded to something openly relieved before she had a chance to arrange it otherwise. He saw it, and he did not say anything about it, which was exactly right. "The petition was received," he said, sitting down across from her and accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Alderman pressed into his hands with the brisk efficiency of someone who had also been waiting. "Judge Watts has reviewed the initial filing. He is issuing a temporary order freezing any action on the estate while it's under investigation. Eli will receive the official notice by courier within the week, but Watts made clear verbally that the order is in effect immediately." Etta closed her eyes for one single moment. Then she opened them again. "And Holt cannot act legally on the estate from this moment forward," Clayton said, "which means whatever hold he thought he had over you is significantly reduced." He paused. "He can still cause trouble if he's the kind of man who ignores legal proceedings." "He's the kind of man who is very careful about which laws he breaks," Etta said, with the particular knowledge of someone who has watched the pattern. "If the court order is in effect, he will go. He doesn't stay where there's no profit in it." "Is that what happened the first time, with the marriage proposal?" She was quiet for a moment, and the quality of her quiet was different from her ordinary composed stillness. It had something heavier in it. "He asked me to marry him the day before I left. It was framed as a kindness. He presented it as security, protection, a continuation of the arrangement my father had trusted him with." She looked down at her hands. "I was alone, and I had been alone for 3 months since my father died, and I would be lying if I said a small part of me did not understand how a woman in my position could say yes to that simply out of exhaustion." She looked up. "But the numbers in the ledger said something different, and I trust numbers." Clayton looked at her for a long time. "You were 25, alone, recently bereaved, with a man in a position of legal authority pressing a marriage on you." "Yes," she said simply. "And instead of accepting it, you duplicated his ledgers and disappeared onto a stagecoach." "It took me 3 weeks to copy everything correctly," she said. "I made myself very busy and very visible and very agreeable while I was doing it, so he wouldn't notice the change in me until I was ready." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That took considerable nerve." "It took considerable anger," she said, "which is almost the same thing but costs more." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. A real laugh, not the polite social variety. And it was warm and entirely genuine, and it changed his face in a way that she felt somewhere specific and warm in her own chest. And she made a note to herself that she should be careful about that, because she had been through enough recently to know that she was currently in a state where she was more vulnerable to warmth than she ordinarily would be. She was not, however, a woman who let careful notes override true observations, and the true observation was that he had come back from Wichita not because it was strictly his business, but because he had made it his, and the distinction mattered enormously. Gerald Holt received the copy of the court order that Eli Cross had waiting for him at the sheriff's office the following afternoon, delivered by Sheriff Briggs himself, with the pleasant efficiency of someone who had been waiting to do this particular errand. Holt read it twice. His face went through several expressions that were not entirely controlled before he arranged it back into its usual smooth certainty. "This is not the end of this matter," he said to Briggs. "No, it's the beginning of the legal process," Briggs agreed pleasantly, "which I imagine is what you'd prefer to any other kind of resolution." Holt looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were calculating the angles. Then he folded the document, put it in his coat pocket, and left Caldwell on horseback the following morning before most of the town was awake. When Etta was told he was gone, she was standing at the back of Mrs. Alderman's kitchen with a mixing bowl in her hands, and she set it down very carefully on the counter and then pressed both hands flat against the counter's surface and breathed out slowly, once, in a way that released something she had been holding for 3 months. Mrs. Alderman, who had the decency to pretend she had not noticed, said briskly, "The bread needs another 20 minutes, and Etta said, "Yes, ma'am," and picked up the bowl again. That Saturday afternoon was the first time Etta walked the full length of the main street since she had arrived, and she walked it in the autumn light with her head up and her amber eyes taking in the ordinary life of the town, the horses tied at the rail, the children running errands, the way the October air smelled of dry grass and wood smoke and the distant promise of winter. And she felt something she identified with some surprise as the tentative beginning of belonging somewhere. She was sitting outside Mrs. Alderman's in the last of the afternoon warmth when Clayton arrived on his Thursday-adjacent supply run, which had shifted to Saturday for reasons she had not questioned, and he tied his horse and walked over and sat on the bench beside the restaurant door and said, "How are you?" And she said, with the kind of honesty that had become, between them, the natural mode of conversation, "Better than I was, still finding my footing." "That takes time," he said. "There's no particular rush." "There seems to be," she said, "when you've arrived somewhere with the clothes you're wearing and a carpet bag and no particular future arranged. You have work," he said. "You have a place to stay. You have a legal case in progress that will, eventually, return to you what your father intended you to have." He paused. "That's a beginning." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him sideways because he was sitting close enough on the bench that direct eye contact had a quality to it she was managing carefully. "You've done a great deal for someone you don't know." "I know enough," he said, and it was the same thing he had said before in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen, but it carried more weight this time because they were both more present to what it meant. She turned to look at him fully. "What do you know exactly?" He met her look without flinching, because he was not a man who flinched from honest questions. "I know you're smart and you're brave and you're alone and you don't complain about being alone. I know you kept your father's memory by keeping his standards. I know you're kind to Sam when he does errands for Mrs. Alderman, and you gave him your leftover biscuits on Tuesday without being asked to, which tells me how you actually are when nobody's watching. I know you read Middlemark," he added, with the small, warm quality that was his version of humor, "which tells me you have good taste and you're not afraid of the large questions." She stared at him. "How do you know I read Middlemark?" "You had it at the table in the kitchen on Thursday. It's a good book, my wife." He paused. It was a brief pause, but she heard it because she had become attuned to the specific frequencies of what he left alone. He continued, "It was on the shelf in my house. It's still there." "I'm sorry," she said. "Mrs. Alderman told me about your wife." "Her name was Mary," he said. "She was a good woman and she died too young, and I miss her. I don't miss her the way you miss someone who might come back. It's been 4 years. I miss her the way you miss something that shaped you." He looked at the street. "I don't say this because it's relevant to anything. I say it because you're someone who deals in straight facts and I'd rather you know mine." She was quiet for a moment, and what she felt was something that she would not have been able to name precisely, a combination of grief for his loss and something careful and bright at the same time, the specific brightness of a man being entirely honest with her about himself. "My father used to say that the people who deal in straight facts are the rarest kind," she said. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Clayton said. "He was the best person I knew," she said, simply and completely, and there was a silence after it that neither of them rushed. November arrived in Caldwell with cold winds coming down from the north and the last of the cattle season wrapping up and the town settling into its quieter winter self. Etta's work at Mrs. Alderman's expanded naturally because she was competent and quick and had a quality of making herself genuinely useful without requiring direction. And Mrs. Alderman, who had spent the first 3 weeks observing this with the careful eye of someone who did not invest her trust in people who had not yet earned it, promoted her to assistant manager, which was not an official title, but was a real function, and came with a room above the restaurant rather than the hotel room, which Etta moved into with the businesslike efficiency of someone who understood that a better situation should be accepted without drama. The room above the restaurant was small but had 2 windows, one facing the main street and one facing east, and in the mornings the eastern window let in the light in a long, warm rectangle across the wooden floor, and Etta kept her George Eliot on the windowsill and read it in the evenings when the restaurant was closed and the kitchen was cleaned and the supply books were current. Clayton came into town on his supply runs with what Mrs. Alderman privately noted was a somewhat increased frequency, though the additional visits always had plausible reasons attached to them. A piece of equipment from the smithy, a conversation with Eli Cross about a separate matter, a visit to the sheriff. None of these reasons were implausible. Mrs. Alderman simply noted that for a man who had previously come to town on a predictable schedule, the schedule had developed what could charitably be called elasticity. He took to sitting at the counter when the restaurant was between rushes, drinking coffee and talking with Etta when she had a moment to stop. Their conversations had the quality of two people who had discovered that the other person was interesting in ways they had not expected, and were now exploring the territory with genuine curiosity and no particular hurry. She told him about her father, William Covington, who had been a merchant in St. Louis, self-made and deeply proud of it in the way of men who had built something with their hands rather than inherited it, who had educated his daughter in numbers and books and straight thinking because, as he said, a woman in this world needed every advantage she could carry, and the best ones fit in your head. She told him about her mother, who had died when Etta was 12, and about growing up after that in the complicated half-managed household of a working father who loved her thoroughly and did not quite know how to raise a daughter alone and made a genuinely good attempt anyway. He told her about the ranch, about how he had come to Kansas at 24 from Ohio with almost nothing, specifically $200, a horse, and the optimism of someone who has not yet been tested by sustained difficulty. About buying the land for the ranch in a year when most men thought cattle was going to make everyone rich, and the small number of men who were not buying cattle land were going to look foolish. About how the cattle made him a reasonable living, and the land was the real thing, good land, his land, with the particular satisfaction of knowing every corner of it. He told her about Mary, a little, in the careful way of someone handling something that had a permanent weight to it. She had grown up in Wichita, the daughter of a banker, and had been perhaps more suited to the life of a town than a working ranch, but she had loved it sincerely and had never complained, and there had been a goodness in her that he felt the loss of in the daily practical ways that grief specifically operated in, which was less about the large dramatic moments and more about reaching for something that was not there. "You haven't thought about leaving?" Etta asked. "After she died, where would I go?" He said, not rhetorically, genuinely, "This is my land, I built it, it's the right place for me." She nodded slowly. She understood that. The belonging to a place, the investment of yourself in something rooted. She had not had it since her father died, and she had lost the house in St. Louis to the complications of the estate, and she had not quite realized how much she missed the feeling until she heard him describe it. "Do you think you could build that again?" she asked. "After everything?" He looked at her steadily. "I think I already started," he said. It was the most direct thing he had said to her that was specifically about them, and the air between them carried it for a moment before he finished his coffee and stood up and said he needed to get to the smithy before it closed, and she said good night, and neither of them made more of it than the moment required, but both of them carried it home. The legal proceedings moved at the pace of territorial courts in 1878, which was not swift, but they moved. Eli Cross, who had taken the case with the professional intensity of a man who enjoyed complicated work and was very good at it, communicated regularly with Judge Watts's court in Wichita, and the picture that the investigation was painting was every bit as detailed and damning as Etta's records had suggested it would be. Gerald Holt had, upon receiving the court order, returned to St. Louis, which was the expected behavior of a man who was careful about which battles he chose. In January of 1879, the court formally removed Holt as trustee of the Covington estate and appointed a court-overseen trustee to manage the estate pending full settlement, which meant that, for the first time in 6 months, the legal ground under Etta's feet was firm. Eli Cross told her this on a January afternoon in his office, which smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and he slid the official notification across the desk with the satisfied expression of someone who has accomplished something worth accomplishing. The court will pursue recovery of the diverted funds through separate proceedings, he said. How much they recover is uncertain. But the estate itself, what remains of it, is protected and is yours. Etta sat with her hands in her lap and read the document twice, and then folded it with her usual careful precision and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, and sat quietly for a moment. "What does this mean practically?" she asked. "You have access to your legitimate funds," Cross said. "Not immediately. There will be a period of weeks while the new trustee formally takes over and the accounts are verified. But you are not, as of today, a woman with nothing." She thanked him in the measured way that meant the gratitude was large, and she walked out of his office into the January cold and stood on the boardwalk and looked up at the hard winter sky over Caldwell and felt something that was not quite elation and was not quite relief, but was something in the territory of both, mixed with a deep and private grief for everything that had led to this point. And she stood there for a moment, allowing herself to feel all of it at the same time. Then she walked to Mrs. Alderman's and put on her apron and started the afternoon prep, because that was who she was. Clayton found out from Eli Cross, who told him in the barber shop the following day, because in a town of 1,200 people information moved through certain channels with the natural efficiency of water finding its path. He received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has hoped for a particular outcome and is glad to see it arrive. And after his haircut, he walked to the restaurant and found Etta alone at the counter in the afternoon lull, doing the week's accounts with the focused concentration she always brought to numbers. He sat down across from her and she looked up with her amber eyes, which had a quality today that he had not seen in them before, a kind of openness, as if something that had been held carefully closed had been allowed to ease. "I heard the news," he said. "It's official," she said. "It's mine again." He smiled. "What will you do?" She set down her pen. She had been thinking about this since yesterday, thinking about it in the methodical way she thought about things that mattered, which was to consider all the angles and then see what the honest answer was when the consideration was complete. "That depends on certain things," she said. "What things?" She looked at him directly. She was, as he had noted many months ago, a woman who dealt in straight facts, and this was a moment that required straight facts. "Whether I have a reason to stay in Caldwell beyond employment and circumstance," she said. "Whether what I think is happening between you and me is actually happening." He was very still for a moment in the specific way that was his form of paying complete attention. Then he said, "Etta." "Yes." "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd Thursday in October," he said. "I have been moving carefully because you had enough happening and you didn't need one more thing to manage, and because I wanted you to trust me before I gave you anything else to think about. But since you're asking me straight, the straight answer is yes. It's happening." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The late January light came through the restaurant windows and lay across the counter between them, and the sound of the town outside was ordinary and continuous, and had nothing to do with this particular moment. "The 3rd Thursday in October," she said. "When you told me you trust numbers," he said. "I've never met anyone who put it exactly that way before, and it was so entirely and exactly you that I didn't have a chance after that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands on the counter, and then she said with the kind of honesty that costs something to say and is worth it anyway, "I don't entirely trust what I feel right now, because I've been through a great deal in the past several months, and I know that affects how things look. But I have never met anyone like you. I don't think I knew that men like you existed specifically until I sat down in this kitchen at the end of October and watched you receive a terrible story about a woman you barely knew and simply decide to help, without asking for anything, without reserving the help against future credit." "You would have done the same," he said. "I'd like to think so," she said. "But I've watched a lot of people in the past year not do the same." He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers very simply, in the way of someone offering a thing rather than taking one. And she looked down at their hands and then back up at him. And the expression on her face was one he would remember for the rest of his life. The specific and particular look of someone who has been alone for a long time and has been given something genuine and is allowing themselves to believe in it. "I would like to come calling," he said. "Properly, if you'll permit it." "I will permit it," she said, and the warmth in her voice when she said it made the January afternoon feel considerably less cold. He came on Sunday. He brought her wildflowers that were technically out of season, but he had found a sheltered spot near the creek where a few stubborn ones were still holding on, which was either persistence or poor judgment depending on your view of autumn botany, and which Etta chose to regard as evidence of someone who paid close enough attention to find things others would have said were not there. She put them in a glass of water on the counter in the restaurant, and Mrs. Alderman looked at them and then at Etta and said nothing at all, which was more eloquent than anything she could have said. They walked after Sunday's supper along the edge of the town, where the houses thinned out and the prairie began, and the evening was cold enough to see their breath, and they walked close enough that their arms were nearly touching without quite touching, and they talked about everything, and nothing in the way of two people who had reached the stage where the conversation itself was the point rather than the information it contained. He told her about the ranch in the kind of specific detail that people only offered to those they were imagining might one day see it. The size of the grazing land, the quality of the creek that ran through the eastern pasture, the barn that he had built himself with Aurelio's help in the spring of 1874. The house, which was modest but solid, with a front porch he had added after the first year because he liked to watch the sun go down. She told him about the house she had grown up in St. Louis, which had been a comfortable red brick row house with a back garden her father had attempted and mostly failed to keep in order, and about how she had taken over the garden at 13 and made it orderly, and her father had looked at it with the expression of a man who was simultaneously impressed and amused. She told him about the places she had wanted to go, the West specifically. She had read about it in books, and it had seemed to her from those books to be a place where the map was still being made, which was different from a place where the map was finished and everything was already named and decided. "Is it what you expected?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, as she did all questions. "It's harder," she said, "and less romantic in the way books describe things. But there's something true about it that the books actually got right, which is that it hasn't decided what it is yet. There's room in it for things that haven't happened." She paused. "That doesn't sound as clear as I meant it." "It sounds exactly clear," he said. "I know what you mean." He stopped walking, and she stopped walking because he had, and they were standing at the edge of the town where the lights behind them were yellow and distant, and the prairie ahead was dark and enormous, and the sky above them was doing its excellent winter star performance, which in Kansas in January was the sort of thing that reminded you of the scale of everything. He turned to face her. She turned to face him. "Etta," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was a first kiss in every sense, careful and sincere and completely certain, the kind that did not ask permission while also asking it, and she kissed him back with an openness that she had not known she was ready for until it was happening, and the cold around them was quite irrelevant. They stood there in the dark at the edge of the prairie for a moment after, and she had her forehead against his shoulder and his arms were around her, and neither of them said anything because nothing that could have been said would have added anything to it. Then she said, into the wool of his coat, "You are the most straightforward person I have ever met." "Is that good?" he asked. "It is," she said, "the best possible thing." February came with serious cold and a blizzard in the second week that kept the town shut in for 3 days and made Clayton's ranch inaccessible from town by riding. And during those 3 days, he could not come in, and she was more conscious of his absence than she had been prepared to be. She sat in the evenings with Middlemark and found her mind drifting, not with anxiety, but with the specific gentle preoccupation of thinking about someone you were happy to think about. When the roads cleared, he was there the following morning before the restaurant was fully open, snow-dusted, and somewhat frostbitten about the ears, and she brought him coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other with the warm, clear look of two people who had both spent the same 3 days thinking about the same person, and did not need to say so. "The calves are doing well," he said, because practicality was one of his love languages even if he would not have used those words. "I was worried about 2 of them in the cold, but they're strong." "I'm glad," she said, and the gladness in her voice was partly for the calves and partly for the fact that he had told her, which meant she was in the category of people whose concern was worth including. He had been thinking, during the blizzard, with the focused deliberateness of someone who uses enforced stillness to work out the things that need working out. He had been thinking about what came next, not in the vague romantic sense of wondering, but in the specific practical sense of a man who takes things seriously and intends to do them right. On a Sunday in late February after supper, with the snow still on the ground but the evening clear and the stars doing their performance again, he took her to the porch of Mrs. Alderman's and said, "I want to show you the ranch." "I'd like that very much," she said. "I also want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He was holding his hat in both hands by the brim, which she had come to recognize as the gesture he made when he was saying something that had weight to it. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her with those storm-green eyes and said, "Will you marry me, Etta Covington?" She was quiet for a moment, but not the uncertainty kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that came from wanting to be sure that what she said next was both true and complete. "I will," she said. "I will, Clayton Prescott, and I want to be sure you know what you're getting, which is a woman who keeps her own accounts and reads George Eliot and will tell you directly when she thinks you're wrong." "I know exactly what I'm getting," he said, with the warmth that had been building in him since October. "That's why I'm asking." She stepped forward, and he met her, and they stayed on the porch in the February cold with their arms around each other, until Mrs. Alderman knocked sharply on the inside of the window and then appeared in the doorway with a coat and the expression of someone who is happy and is expressing it as practicality. "It is 20 degrees, Mrs. Alderman said. "Come inside. I have coffee and pie and I want to hear everything." They were married in the first week of April, in the Caldwell church that the pastor was still fundraising to finish, but which was solid enough for this particular purpose, with the morning light coming in through the unfinished windows in a way that was perhaps more beautiful for being imperfect. Mrs. Alderman was there, and Eli Cross, and Aurelio Vega and his wife Consuela, and Sheriff Briggs and his deputy, and Sam the errand boy who stood in the back with enormous serious eyes, and the handful of other Caldwell residents who had come to know Etta in the months since she arrived. She wore the dark blue dress, the one she had arrived in, cleaned and mended and pressed to a sharpness that made it look like a deliberate choice rather than a necessity, because it was her dress and she had arrived in it, and there was something right about that. She carried the wildflowers that Aurelio's wife Consuela had arranged for her, early spring flowers from the creek, the first ones of the year. Clayton stood at the front of the church in the dark suit that he had owned since the last serious occasion, which had been a court appearance in Wichita 3 years ago, and which he still wore correctly, and he watched her walk up the aisle with the specific stillness of someone who cannot quite believe that this particular thing is happening, but is entirely willing to accept that it is. The pastor, a lean, earnest man named Reverend Cole, who had been in Caldwell for 2 years and who had performed 14 weddings and 41 funerals, married them in the plain language of the Methodist tradition, and when he reached the part about the vows, Clayton said his in a clear, low voice that did not waver, and when Etta said hers, she looked at him directly the entire time. And when the pastor said they were married, Clayton put both hands on her face very gently and kissed her, and the small congregation made sounds of approval, and Sam fell off the pew in enthusiasm and had to be retrieved. They had a wedding supper at Mrs. Alderman's naturally, because there was no other reasonable venue, and because Mrs. Alderman had been planning it for 3 weeks and was not about to have it held anywhere else. The food was extraordinary because Mrs. Alderman was extraordinary when she applied herself to something that mattered, and the evening was warm enough to have the windows open, and Aurelio played guitar in the corner with a quiet skill that no one had asked about and everyone appreciated. And Clayton and Etta sat side by side at the table that had been theirs in the kitchen across all these months of talking and being known to each other. And the evening was entirely and quietly the best evening either of them could remember. She moved to the ranch the next morning. She had packed her carpet bag and the one additional bag she had accumulated during the months in Caldwell. And when they rode out of town together in the clear April morning with everything she owned in the wagon bed and her hand in his, she looked back at the town, once with an expression that was warm and grateful, and then looked forward at the road. The ranch was 4 miles east of town, and when it came into view over the long, gentle rise in the road, she looked at it with the particular attention she brought to things she was going to love. It was exactly as he had described, a solid, modest house with a front porch, a large barn that had the quality of something built with care, the creek in the eastern pasture catching the morning light, the grazing land wide and open and already touched with the green of early spring. It was not grand. It was real, and real was better than grand in every way that counted. "It needs a kitchen garden," she said. "I've been meaning to do something with that back corner for 3 years," he said. "I'll take care of it," she said, in the tone of someone making a statement of intention rather than asking permission, and he smiled at the side of his face turned toward her, which was the smile she liked most because it was involuntary. She met Aurelio properly that morning, and Consuela his wife, who was warm and forthright and had opinions about the kitchen that were in almost all ways the same as Etta's own opinions about the kitchen. And they established an immediate, comfortable alliance based on competence and directness that Clayton observed with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching two things fit naturally together. There were 2 ranch hands in addition to Aurelio, younger men named Pete and Daniel who were respectful and slightly awestruck in the way of men who have worked a bachelor ranch for years, and are now confronted with the presence of a woman who clearly runs things as a natural state of being. The kitchen garden was begun within the week, and the accounts of the ranch were reorganized within the month, because while Clayton was a good rancher and an honest one, his record-keeping had the quality of someone who knew what he was doing but had never been taught to document it, and Etta moved through the ledgers with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they were made to do. She also, during this time, began to understand the ranch in the specific way that you understand a place when you are going to belong to it. The quality of the light at different hours, which was different out here from the light in town in ways that mattered. The sound of the creek at night. The particular way the horses in the barn settled into their particular noises after supper. The enormous, uninterrupted silence of the prairie dark, that was not empty but full of things that had been there since before any of them arrived and would be there after. She sat on the porch on evenings and watched the sun go down the way he had said he liked to do, and sometimes he sat beside her, and sometimes she was alone, and both were good. In May, a letter arrived from Eli Cross informing her that the court proceedings against Gerald Holt had concluded their first phase, and that a portion of the diverted funds, approximately 60% of the total, roughly $6,000, had been recovered and would be transferred to the estate under the court-appointed trustee, with the remainder under continued pursuit. This was not everything, but it was substantially more than nothing, and it was justice of the practical, documented kind, which was the kind she had always trusted most. She folded the letter and sat with it for a moment and then walked out to the barn where Clayton was working with one of the horses, a bay mare that had been difficult since the winter and required patient handling, and she stood in the barn door with the letter, and he looked up at her face and understood from it that whatever the letter said was good. She told him the amount. He nodded slowly. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked, which was the right question. "Part of it should go to the legal fees," she said. "Cross's fees are covered," he said. She looked at him. He shrugged with the careful casualness of someone who has already decided something and is not making a production of it. "I took care of it in February," he said, "before I asked you to marry me, so there's no confusion about motive. It wasn't a condition." She was quiet for a long moment looking at him, and he kept his attention on the mare because he was not a man who made generous gestures and then waited for applause. "You paid his fees," she said. "You needed the case to proceed and you had nothing to pay him with at the time," he said plainly. "It seemed like the right thing to do. Clayton." He looked at her. "I am going to need a moment," she said. He nodded, put down the brush, came across the barn and put his arms around her and held her while she pressed her face against his shoulder for exactly 2 minutes, which was the specific amount of time she allowed herself to be overwhelmed before she required herself to be practical again. And he knew this by now, and held her for exactly as long as she needed, and not one moment longer, because knowing someone specifically was the real definition of loving them. "The rest should go toward the eastern pasture fence," she said, against his shoulder. "I know you've been meaning to repair the whole north section and holding off on the cost." "We can talk about that," he said. "The numbers work," she said. "I'll show you tonight." "I know you'll show me tonight," he said, with the warmth in his voice that had become the most reliable sound in her world. Summer came to the Prescott ranch with heat and work and the particular richness of a life that was full in the way that mattered. The kitchen garden produced abundantly, which was the outcome of someone who paid attention to what a thing needed and provided it consistently. Etta rode out with Clayton on the days when the work allowed it, learning the land the way you learned it only by riding it, and she became by slow degrees something that she had not expected to become, which was someone who knew where they were and could not imagine being anywhere else. She wrote to Mrs. Alderman every 2 weeks, because Mrs. Alderman was the kind of person who made a debt of affection and expected the installments to be regular. And the letters she received back were full of news about Caldwell delivered in the brisk, loving style of someone who would never say outright that they missed you, but who was clearly saying exactly that in every line. She wrote also to 2 friends she had left behind in St. Louis, carefully worded letters that said what could be said and implied what could not, and received letters back from one of them that confirmed, among other things, that Gerald Holt had taken himself to Chicago, which was either an escape or a reinvention, and possibly both. The court proceedings against him continued without requiring her presence, which was one of the advantages of having built a thorough and self-explanatory case. In September, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Clayton on the front porch on a Sunday evening in September, watching the sun go down over the prairie the way they always did, and she said it plainly and directly as she said everything, and his face did the thing where everything on it became very still and very certain at the same time. The expression she had come to understand was his form of the deepest feeling, and he took both of her hands in both of his and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "You'll tell me if that changes." "I will tell you immediately," she said. He raised her hands and pressed his lips against them, and the gesture was simple and completely sufficient, and they sat together on the porch in the September warmth, with the sun going down and the sound of the creek in the eastern pasture, and the horses settling in the barn, and everything around them absolutely and precisely right. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a working winter, as all winters on a working ranch were, and Etta managed the increasingly interesting arithmetic of growing a child while also managing accounts, a kitchen garden in its dormant season, a correspondence with Eli Cross about the ongoing proceedings, the reorganization of the supply records for the year, and a growing friendship with Consuela Vega that had the comfortable depth of women who had found in each other the particular recognition of seeing someone who handled things in the same manner. Consuela, who had 3 children of her own and a fourth matter-of-fact opinion about everything pertaining to childbirth and children, was an invaluable presence through the winter months, and Etta received her practical advice with the gratitude of someone who recognized expertise in its proper form. Clayton, for his part, proved to be the specific variety of husband who managed the anxiety of impending fatherhood by doing things. The room adjacent to the bedroom was cleared and furnished, methodically and carefully, with a crib he built himself in the evenings after supper, working by lamplight in the way that spoke more clearly than any declaration. He asked Etta every morning how she was feeling and received her honest answer, and did not catastrophize the bad days or dismiss the good ones. And she found as the months passed that the word she kept returning to when she thought about him was the same word she had felt on that first evening in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen safe, in the specific and irreplaceable definition of the word, which had nothing to do with the absence of difficulty, and everything to do with the presence of someone you could trust absolutely. The baby came in the middle of March 1880, on a night that had started clear and turned into a proper spring thunderstorm, the kind that arrived in Kansas with operatic commitment and filled the house with the sound of it. Consuela was there, and the doctor from town, who had ridden the 4 miles in the rain without complaint. Clayton was in the front room because that was the arrangement, listening to the storm and the sounds of the house, and doing the thing that men in this situation were required to do, which was to be entirely present while being technically out of the way, and this required a specific kind of endurance that he managed without complaint. The baby arrived just before midnight, and the first sound of him was entirely audible over the sound of the storm, clear and loud and entirely certain of his own existence. The doctor appeared in the doorway and said, "Mr. Prescott, you have a son. Both are well." Clayton stood up and went to the door and looked at his wife sitting, propped in the bed with the baby, his son, in her arms. And her face was tired and extraordinary and entirely recognizable as the face of someone who had just done something that required every quality they possessed, and had found that they possessed all of them. She looked up at him and smiled, and it was the smile he had first seen on the porch outside Mrs. Alderman's all those months ago, the one with the surprise in it, except now the surprise was different, not the surprise of receiving something good when you did not expect good things, but the surprise of a goodness larger than even the hope of it. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at their son, who was red and emphatic and entirely himself. He started. "Quite loud," Etta said. "Quite present," he said, which was the same thing said differently. "What should we call him?" she asked. "I've been thinking about William," he said. And the look on her face when he said it, the way it moved through her like light through water, was the moment that confirmed for both of them, if it had ever been in doubt, that they were doing the right thing together. "William Clayton Prescott," she said, trying it. "Sounds like someone who would have an opinion," he said. "He already does," she said, because William had a great deal to say about his first night on earth and was being clear about it. The storm passed before morning and left behind it the specific clean-washed clarity of a world after rain, and in the first light of the morning, Clayton stood on the front porch of his house looking out at his land, and he felt the weight of the past 6 years and the particular quality of the present moment, which was that everything had led here and here was exactly right. Etta's voice came from inside, calling him back, and he went. Spring of 1880 was the beginning of a different kind of life on the Prescott Ranch, the kind that had a center to it, a small, noisy center with strong opinions and his mother's amber eyes. William was an energetic, curious baby who regarded the world from the beginning with the specific focused attention of someone who had a great deal to learn and intended to learn it thoroughly. And he made the ranch louder and more vivid and entirely better. Mrs. Alderman came out from town to visit in May, and held William with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who had no children of their own and was very good with other people's. And she told Etta that the restaurant was doing well, and that she had hired a girl named Ruth who was competent and honest. And she told Clayton that he looked like a man who had found his bearing, which was the highest compliment in Mrs. Alderman's considerable vocabulary of approval. "You both do," she said, looking at them standing together on the porch with William between them. "You both look like people who know where they are." It was, Etta thought later, the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about them. She knew where she was. After all the months of not knowing, after the loss and the flight and the carefully duplicated ledgers and the stagecoach, and arriving in a strange town with a carpet bag, and no letter of introduction, and a story she could not tell to most of the world, she was here, on this porch, on this land, with this man beside her and this child in her arms, and the knowledge was as solid and certain as the land under her feet. In the summer of 1880, the final settlement of the Covington estate was completed by the district court in Wichita, with a total recovery of approximately 73% of the diverted funds, which was a better outcome than most similar cases achieved. And Eli Cross wrote to her with the justified pride of a man who had handled the thing exactly as well as it could be handled. Gerald Holt, who had been located in Chicago, agreed to a civil settlement in lieu of full criminal proceedings, and the specifics of that settlement were not Etta's preferred form of justice, but were the available form, and she was someone who understood the difference. She used part of her recovered funds to invest in the ranch's expansion, the north fence that had needed replacing, 2 additional pieces of good breeding stock, and the finishing of a second water trough on the western grazing land that Clayton had been planning for 2 years. She kept the rest in a separate account at the Caldwell Bank under her own name, because she was someone who had learned specific lessons about financial independence and intended to pass those lessons along, eventually, to the small person currently learning to pull himself to a standing position using the bottom rung of the kitchen chairs. The autumn of 1880 arrived with the particular beauty that Kansas autumn reserved for days when it chose to be generous, the wide sky going to deep blue, and the light angling golden over the grass, and the air carrying the smell of harvest and distance. Etta stood in the kitchen garden in October, turning the soil over for winter, with William in a blanket on the grass nearby in the sunshine, talking to himself in the authoritative manner he had developed as his primary mode of expression. She heard Clayton's horse before she saw him coming back from the southern pasture, the particular quality of the hoofbeats that she could distinguish now from the other horses, and she looked up and watched him come over the rise and down toward the house, and the way he sat a horse, and the way the light fell on him, and the way he raised his hand when he saw her, and the particular expression of his face at distance that she could read now as clearly as she read her own ledger. All of it was so deeply and specifically known to her that it felt like the answer to a question she had been asking for years without being able to articulate the question. He came into the kitchen garden and looked at her and looked at William and looked at the turned earth with the practical appreciation of someone who respected work for its own sake. He swung down from the horse and tied it to the fence post and came and stood beside her. "The south herd is settled," he said. "We'll move them before the freeze. The accounts show we can take on 2 more head this season if we want," she said. "I was going to show you tonight." "After supper," he said. "After supper," she agreed. William had managed to get himself from the blanket to a sitting position on the bare earth, and was regarding a beetle with the total absorbing interest of someone encountering something magnificent for the first time. Clayton reached over and tucked a strand of hair back that the wind had brought across her face, and the gesture was so ordinary and so completely right that she turned her face toward it for a moment the way you turn toward warmth. "Are you happy, Etta?" he said. She looked at the garden and the land and her son on the earth in the October sunshine, and the man beside her, and then she looked at him directly with her amber eyes that had always told the truth. "Happier than I know how to say," she said, and I'm fairly good with words." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the kitchen garden with William and the beetle and the afternoon light, and the sound of the creek in the eastern pasture, and the sky above them going from blue to that particular amber gold of October in Kansas, wide and absolutely enormous and perfectly indifferent to whether any of this was happening, which somehow only made it better, more specific, more real, more entirely theirs. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1878, with no letter of introduction. She had brought with her a story she could not tell, not then, not in the way that required trust she had not yet earned in time that she could not spare. She had brought her records and her honesty and her capacity for numbers and her hard-won, well-maintained ability to look at a situation straight and see it as it was rather than as she wished it to be. He had said he did not need the letter or the story. He had looked at her in Mrs. Alderman's kitchen with those storm-green eyes and received the truth of who she was without the documentation, and he had given her his help freely and his regard carefully and his love completely. And he had built beside her out of straight facts and hard work, and the quiet certainty of people who know their own minds, something that was, by any honest accounting, a life. 2 years later, in the spring of 1882, Etta knew there would be a second child, and when she told Clayton, he smiled the slow, certain smile that she loved most because it was entirely involuntary. And William, who was 2 years old and deeply suspicious of changes to his known world, patrolled the house with increased vigilance for several weeks before apparently deciding this was something he would permit. The second child, a girl this time, arrived in November of 1882 on a clear cold night under a sky so full of stars it seemed to be compensating for the winter darkness, and they named her Ruth, after the girl Mrs. Alderman had hired, who had become, in the 2 years since, a genuine friend to Etta, and Mrs. Alderman, when she was told, sat down in her kitchen chair and made the sound of someone who was very pleased and was expressing it through absolute silence. Ruth was quieter than William from the beginning, but no less certain, and she regarded the world with the specific focused amber eyes she had inherited from her mother. And Etta looked at those eyes on her daughter's face and felt something that was larger than she had words for, which for a woman who was excellent with words was the best possible indication of its size. The ranch grew, not extravagantly but steadily, in the way of things built right. Aurelio and Consuelo were there through it all, the kind of constant and reliable presence that was not taken for granted precisely because its value was understood. Pete and Daniel, the ranch hands, stayed for years in the way that people stayed when the work was honest and the employer was fair. Eli Cross became a friend of the particular kind made in legal proceedings, which was a friendship forged in stress and therefore unusually solid. And Caldwell changed too, the way western cattle towns changed in the 1880s, as the cattle drives shifted and the railroad made different demands, and the town had to decide what it was going to be next. It became more settled, quieter, with more families and fewer drifters, and the church that Reverend Cole had always been fundraising was finally completed in 1883 and was a very satisfying building when finished. Etta and Clayton were there on the day it was finished, with William holding Ruth's hand because he had appointed himself her official supervisor, and Mrs. Alderman standing beside them, complaining affectionately about the quality of the windows, and clearly approving of everything about it. Etta stood in the completed church in the autumn of 1883 and looked at the windows that were now properly installed, and the wooden floor that had been there from the beginning, and the community of people around her who were in various ways her people, her town, her life. And she thought about the woman who had stepped down from a stagecoach on a Tuesday 4 years ago with a carpet bag and a silence around her, and a story she could not tell. She could tell it now. She could tell it plainly and completely, because all the complicated pieces had been resolved into something whole. The story was not only the estate and the legal proceedings and the flight from St. Louis, which was the part that had driven her here. The story was also this: the kitchen garden and the accounts and Mrs. Alderman and Aurelio's guitar on her wedding evening, and the blizzard in February when she had missed Clayton for 3 days and understood from the missing what she felt, and the front porch in the evening watching the sun go down, and William's first year and Ruth's amber eyes and the creek in the eastern pasture, and the sound of his horse coming over the rise. The story was what you arrived with and what you found and what you built from the combination of both. And it was, by the most reliable measure she had, her own honest accounting, the truest and best one she knew. She looked across the church and found Clayton, who had been talking with Sheriff Briggs and had looked over at precisely the same moment, and their eyes met across the Sunday morning crowd of Caldwell in the way that had become their private language over 4 years of knowing each other entirely, the look that said everything directly without requiring a single word. He was exactly what she had not expected to find here. And she knew from the way he had always looked at her, exactly what he had not known he was waiting for. She went to where he was standing, and he put his hand at the small of her back in the familiar, certain way, and said something quiet to Briggs, who smiled and excused himself. And she looked up at Clayton in the light of the completed church on a clear November morning in 1883, with their children nearby and their friends around them, and the life they had built somewhere in both directions, and she said, simply, "I'm glad I got on that stagecoach." He looked down at her with the storm-green eyes that she knew now in every kind of light, in every kind of weather, in every quality of feeling. "So am I," he said, "every day." Outside, the Kansas sky was doing its enormous, unhurried thing, blue and wide, and full of everything still to come, and the Prescott Ranch was 4 miles east, and the kitchen garden was ready for spring, and the accounts were current, and the creek ran clear in the eastern pasture, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.